This is what we want when we're finished. A flush set stone with a nice smooth line all the way around holding the stone in, and a culet that doesn't stick through the back. That's it. We're going to gypsy set a stone into a flat piece of metal. This will be big enough that you can use it for a dog tag pendant if you wish. If you're going to do that, tidy up all of the edges, drill your hole, make the piece the way you want it to look before you set the stone. If you set the stone correctly, you won't have any more cleanup to do. First thing you do is measure the height of your stone, the diameter and the height. We want to measure the diameter because we need to know what size drill and then burr to use. So if you're using digital calipers, zero them. Measure the girdle, which is the outside. Now this says it's 4.04, which is great because we can use a 4mm burr and it'll be just a slight interference fit. Now because this is a gypsy setting, we need to know the height of the stone because the gypsy setting is a flush setting and our metal has to be that thick. So put the table on the jaw of your calipers and read from the point, which is the culet. Yep. From the point to the top, from the culet to the table. Now this is 2.74, which means that our metal has to be a minimum of 2.74. So if you don't have a piece of metal that's almost 3mm thick, what you do is you just take another little piece of metal. I've just punched out a disc. We'll sweat solder this onto the main piece. And because I actually need 3 layers, because I don't have a thick one, what I'll do is I'll sweat solder the first one on, and then I'll sweat solder another one on top of that one, and then I'll have my height. The reason we're sweat soldering these is we'll have a tiny amount of solder on the outside that we won't have to do any cleanup. So let's do this first. We're using hard solder for this. When you put your metal on a charcoal block or on a soldering block, make sure that there isn't old flux underneath it, otherwise it's going to put a mark on the metal that you'll have to clean up later. Hard solder for this. Now, flex the back of your piece and position your solder with your flux brush because the solder needs to be fluxed along with the piece. So plenty of solder. Basically you're visualizing how much solder that you will need to just fill the gap between this and what you're soldering it onto. Because what you don't want to do is have to put a little piece of solder on the outside later to make sure that it solders. So be slightly generous with the solder. I'll move this in. So you can see that there's a fair amount of solder on there. What you want to do now is use your same neutral flame that you always use. And just gently heat this up until the flux dries out. There. I'm going to do the other one now, too. Now, 50 mil away, and just circle the piece. The flux goes clear, the solder will flow. There. Stop at that point. It doesn't have to flow over the whole piece, it just needs to start to flow. Now what we'll do is flux the main piece and we'll turn the disc over and solder that on. So you don't have to do anything to the disc at this moment. It's still fluxed. We just put our main piece on the charcoal, flux it, and I would suggest fluxing the whole thing to help keep the fire scale down. So now just flip this over with your tweezers. It'll still be hot. And position it where you want it to solder. Now what you don't want to do on this is you don't want to heat the disc. You want to heat the underneath bit so that everything comes up to soldering temperature, so that when you do move your flame up on top, you'll have just the tiniest ring of solder. If you heat that disc, what's going to happen is when the solder flows, it's going to jump up on top and give you something to clean up. So we'll put that on a piece of screen to do our soldering. The reason we're using the screen is so that the flame will go underneath. You can put this on a tripod and just heat it from underneath, like this. Now you want to be careful that the screen doesn't have any weird stuff on it either. So that's just wax. Now what I need to do is position this disc, because the flux is drying out. So you keep the flux warm and you can push it wherever you want it. I'm going right for the middle. Now you can see I'm bouncing the flame under here because I actually want the underneath warmer than the top at the moment. So you don't have to heat the whole thing now. Just bounce the flame underneath. When the flux goes clear, like this, it'll be really close to soldering. The silver can be a dull red, and at the point where you think it's ready for soldering, you just bring your flame up on top. You'll see the solder flow and stop. Pull your flame away. Now if you want, you can position the second one at this time. A little bit of flux on top of the disc, and position the second one right on that spot. The flux will dry out almost immediately. You'll have to warm it up to push the piece around. Now same story. We want everything warm except that disc. And because silver is the way it is, being the best heat transmitter there is, it will come up to temperature whether you put your flame directly on it or not. So we just want to bring the whole thing up to temperature, never putting the flame on what we're sweat soldering on until the very last. So we can see that everything's up to temperature. Just bring your flame up on top. You'll have a nice clean solder line all the way around. Take the flame away, quench it, and pickle it. While it's pickling, we can get ready to set the stone. We've measured it. We know it's just under 4 millimeters. We'll need a 1 millimeter bit as a pilot hole. You always start with a small hole first. You don't just go for the full size that you want. Then we'll drill with a 2 millimeter bit, because that'll follow that through quite easily. Then we'll drill with the 3 millimeter bit, which will leave us 1/2 mil on either side of the hole for the stone to set on. Then we'll need a 4 millimeter burr, and what you do is you put the burr in the wide part of the jaws and you turn it. And the reason you turn it is to get the real size of the burr. If you just, with this one, if I just measure it, it's 4.23. If I turn it, it's actually 4.27. So turn it to get the real measurement. So this is obviously too big. If I burr in with that, the stone will just fall out. So always measure your burr, even if I give it to you. And you can see this is 3.95, which is just under 4, which is what we want. So that's our round burr. And now we'll use a stone setting burr, which just has a straight side and an angle on the bottom to match the stone. So you can see this has straight side and an angle to match the stone. Now, the reason I use the mini drill press is if you're a little bit off with this, this is going to cut into the side and make the hole really big. So make sure it's the right size along with the round one. So 398, perfect. So now we'll set up the drill press. Once the piece is pickled, have a look at it. Make sure that your solder is all nice. You can polish this now if you want, or you can wait until you're finished, either way. So the first thing you're going to do is have to put a punch mark where you're going to drill. And if the piece is something that you don't actually want to hit with a hammer, you can use your pendant drill, take a 1 millimeter burr, and put it in the pendant drill and turn it sideways. I'll show you. So just hold the piece in your hand sideways like this and spin it up, and you can just touch the burr to the metal. And it'll make you a little impression where your drill bit will start without wandering away. When you're ready to drill, put the piece on a piece of wood initially, and for the first hole you can hold it in your fingers. So just chuck the 1 millimeter drill bit up. A little bit of wax as soon as you turn it on. So just touch the wax to the bit. Hold the piece firmly with your fingers and just a little bit at a time drill all the way through. So that's a 1 millimeter bit. We're going to go through with the 2 millimeter bit now. Now from here on, put the piece of metal in a little machinist vise, and that way if anything catches, it won't spin and cut you. There's a little ledge on the vise that you can clamp that into. A little bit of wax on the bit. You just slowly go through. Then the 3 millimeter bit.